The artifacts that James Caldwell unearthed beneath his family's collapsed century-old silo didn't just rewrite his understanding of his Pennsylvanian heritage. They revealed a historical conspiracy so profound that it would force archaeologists to question everything they thought they knew about America's ancient past. What began as a catastrophic structural failure during an early spring storm would uncover a chamber that had remained undisturbed since 1919, containing objects that, by all historical accounts, simply shouldn't exist. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Caldwell Farm had persisted through generations while neighboring properties surrendered to corporate agriculture's relentless advance. Nestled in the rolling hills of Monroe County, Pennsylvania, the 180-acre property had weathered economic depressions, agricultural revolutions, and changing market demands under the stewardship of 4 generations of Caldwells. The imposing brick silo, constructed by James's great-grandfather Frederick in 1919, had become something of a local landmark, its unusual proportions and distinctive iron banding setting it apart from more conventional agricultural structures that dotted the landscape. At 46, James had watched with growing anxiety as family farms throughout the valley succumbed to mounting financial pressures, their lands absorbed by Riverview Agricultural Enterprises, a faceless corporate entity whose massive operations now surrounded the Caldwell property like an encroaching tide. The old silo had been decommissioned nearly 25 years ago when modern grain storage techniques rendered such structures obsolete, but something had always prevented James from demolishing it, despite the county's increasingly insistent notices about structural concerns. Local stories about Frederick Caldwell's peculiar obsession with the silo's construction had been passed down through generations in Willow Creek. How he'd imported specialized materials from across the country, consulted with engineers from as far away as Chicago and Boston, and worked from designs that he kept locked in a steel box when not in use. The few surviving photographs from the construction showed teams of workers Frederick had brought in from outside the community rather than using local farmhands, unusual for the tight-knit farming community of that era. What made the silo truly distinctive wasn't merely its external appearance, but the puzzling complexity of its internal design. Unlike the straightforward cylindrical void of standard grain silos, the Caldwell structure contained a network of narrow maintenance corridors between its double-walled construction. James's father had always dismissed these architectural oddities as his grandfather's excessive concern for structural integrity, but upcoming events would cast them in an entirely different light. The catastrophic failure came during an unusually violent spring storm in March 2023. After enduring more than a century of Pennsylvania's harsh seasonal cycles, the eastern face of the silo finally surrendered to a combination of age, neglect, and a lightning strike that shook the countryside. James, along with his wife Rebecca and their children Ethan and Lily, watched from the farmhouse windows as a significant portion of the outer brick wall collapsed in a thunderous cascade, revealing portions of the silo's inner chambers that had never been accessible during regular maintenance. The family waited until morning to inspect the damage. As dawn broke over the farm, illuminating the debris field with golden light, 17-year-old Ethan was the first to notice something unusual protruding from beneath the rubble. What appeared to be the edge of a metal door embedded in the foundation, a door that should not have existed according to any known plans of the structure. "Dad, you need to see this," Ethan called out, his phone's flashlight illuminating the edge of a sophisticated locking mechanism unlike anything that would have been installed in a standard agricultural building of the early 20th century. What truly catalyzed their investigation, however, was what Rebecca discovered that evening while sorting through old family documents in preparation for their insurance claim. Tucked between the pages of a weathered farming almanac from 1919, she found a sealed envelope addressed in Frederick Caldwell's distinctive handwriting, to be opened only when the inner chamber is revealed. Inside was a single brass key and a cryptic note that read, "What lies beneath is not for our time. The collection must remain sealed until the world has eyes to truly see and wisdom to understand its implications. Do not venture further without guidance from those who know." The note bore an unusual symbol, a triangle containing a stylized eye and what appeared to be ancient writing around its perimeter. James might have dismissed it as his great-grandfather's eccentricity, except for the remarkable coincidence of the envelope's discovery on the very day the silo's collapse had revealed a hidden door. That night, as a steady rain washed over the farm, James found himself unable to sleep. In his home office, illuminated only by the soft glow of his desk lamp, he began researching Frederick Caldwell's history beyond the family narratives he'd grown up with. Tax records, property transactions, and old newspaper articles revealed a more complex figure than family legend suggested. Before establishing the farm, Frederick had apparently traveled extensively between 1900 and 1915, a surprising revelation for a supposed lifelong farmer. Ship manifests showed journeys to Egypt, Greece, Turkey, and Peru. More curiously, bank records indicated substantial financial transactions with museums and private collectors, suggesting he was involved in the acquisition or sale of antiquities, an occupation never mentioned in family histories. Most puzzling were the letters James discovered in a forgotten file box in the attic, correspondence between Frederick and prominent archaeologists, historians, and museum curators of his era. These weren't casual exchanges, but detailed discussions about archaeological discoveries, ancient technologies, and what they obliquely referred to as anomalous artifacts. Many letters mentioned an organization called the Keepers of Antiquity and contained the same triangular symbol from Frederick's sealed note. By morning, James had pieced together a troubling alternative narrative about his great-grandfather. Frederick Caldwell appeared to have been part of a network of individuals involved in the concealment of archaeological findings that contradicted established historical timelines. But why would they hide archaeological discoveries inside a grain silo in rural Pennsylvania? And what exactly lay behind that metal door in the silo's foundation? These questions took on greater urgency against the backdrop of the Caldwell family's deteriorating financial situation. The farm that had sustained 4 generations of Caldwells was now drowning in debt. Modern agricultural economics had made small, independent operations increasingly untenable. Equipment loans, property taxes, and operating costs had piled up, while crop prices remained stagnant. Rebecca had taken a second job teaching evening science classes, while Ethan and Lily both worked part-time jobs after school to help make ends meet. The breakfast table conversation that morning centered not on the mysterious silo, but on the latest offer from Riverview Agricultural Enterprises. The corporate farming conglomerate had increased their purchase offer to a figure that would clear all the family's debts and still leave enough to relocate and start fresh, perhaps in a suburb where James could find employment that didn't involve the constant struggle against weather, markets, and machinery breakdowns. "We need to at least consider it," Rebecca said softly, sliding the official letter across the table. "The bank called yesterday. They're not extending the equipment loan." James stared at the corporate letterhead, his coffee growing cold. Selling meant being the first Caldwell to surrender the land in 4 generations. It meant abandoning not just a farm, but a legacy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The weight of that responsibility had kept him awake as many nights as their financial concerns. "Let's wait," he said finally. "Just a few days. There's something I need to check first." Later that morning, James contacted Professor Samuel Winters at the State University's History Department, sending photographs of Frederick's letters and the mysterious symbol. The professor's response came within hours, requesting an immediate meeting at the farm. He arrived just before dusk, accompanied by Dr. Vanessa Rodriguez, an anthropologist specializing in controversial archaeological findings. As twilight cast long shadows across the farm, the professors examined the exposed door in the silo foundation with growing excitement. The locking mechanism, though coated with a century of grime, appeared to be operational. "This is extraordinary craftsmanship," Professor Winters murmured, his flashlight illuminating intricate engravings around the door's frame, symbols that matched those on Frederick's letter. These aren't decorative elements. They're a form of ancient writing system that predates known Mesopotamian scripts. They shouldn't be on a structure built in rural Pennsylvania in 1919. Dr. Rodriguez's careful examination revealed more anomalies. The metal composition is unusual. This isn't standard early 20th century alloy, and these locking mechanisms, they're designed to prevent access from the outside, but also to maintain specific environmental conditions within. Whatever's inside, your great-grandfather went to extraordinary lengths to preserve it. With Ethan and Lily recording every moment on their phones, James produced Frederick's brass key. After applying penetrating oil to the ancient mechanism, and with careful manipulation, they heard a series of distinct clicks followed by a release of pressure, as if the chamber beyond had been hermetically sealed for a century. The heavy door swung open with surprising ease, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that escaped carried a strange, dry scent, not the mustiness one would expect from a sealed underground chamber, but something more, akin to the atmosphere of a climate-controlled museum vault. Professor Winters insisted on proper documentation before they proceeded further, establishing a basic protocol for their exploration. Equipped with powerful LED flashlights, dust masks, and Ethan's drone fitted with additional lighting, they began their descent into Frederick Caldwell's hidden chamber. What they discovered defied explanation. The staircase led to a circular room, approximately 30 feet in diameter with a domed ceiling. The walls were lined with glass-fronted cabinets containing hundreds of artifacts, each carefully mounted and labeled in Frederick's handwriting. But it was the nature of these artifacts that left the professors speechless. "This is impossible," Dr. Rodriguez whispered, her voice tight with controlled excitement as she examined a small statuary piece. "This appears to be a pre-Columbian representation of a human figure operating what resembles mechanical equipment, similar to controversial pieces from South American collections that most mainstream archaeologists dismiss as hoaxes." Professor Winters moved from cabinet to cabinet with growing astonishment. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs depicting what appear to be electric lighting devices. Sumerian tablets with diagrams of mechanical principles that weren't discovered until the Renaissance. Stone carvings showing anatomically correct dinosaurs alongside human figures. These are the types of artifacts that are systematically excluded from museum collections because they contradict established historical narratives. The central feature of the chamber, however, was what truly defied conventional historical understanding. A large stone disc covered with intricate carvings that bore striking resemblance to technical schematics, complete with mathematical notations that shouldn't have been known to the ancient civilization that produced it. "This is the Bolivian sun disk," Professor Winters breathed, circling the artifact with reverence. It was discovered in 1911, created a brief sensation in archaeological circles, and then disappeared completely from historical record. It was dismissed as a hoax because it suggested technical knowledge that couldn't possibly have existed in pre-contact South America. "No," Dr. Rodriguez corrected, examining the labels in Frederick's handwriting. "This is one of 3 such discs. Your great-grandfather's notes indicate the other 2 remain in their original locations. The Smithsonian reportedly has photographs of one of them in their restricted archives." Nay, as the initial shock of their discovery began to subside, they noticed a leather-bound journal placed prominently on a central pedestal. The book, its pages preserved in the chamber's controlled environment, contained Frederick Caldwell's detailed account of how he had become involved with the Keepers of Antiquity, a clandestine international network of archeologists, historians, and collectors who had taken it upon themselves to preserve archaeological evidence that contradicted mainstream historical narratives. According to Frederick's journal, during the archaeological boom of the early 20th century, as museums and universities raced to claim artifacts from ancient sites around the world, certain discoveries were quietly removed from the record. Findings that suggested ancient civilizations had possessed knowledge or technology that didn't fit the established timeline of human development. Again, says, "The public institutions cannot be trusted with these truths," Frederick had written. "When confronted with evidence that challenges their established frameworks, they have repeatedly chosen to hide, discredit, or destroy the artifacts rather than reconsider their theories. We of the Keepers have established secure repositories across the globe, entrusting members to protect these pieces of our true history until humanity develops the wisdom to confront its implications." The journal detailed how Frederick had volunteered his remote Pennsylvania farm as one such repository, designing the silo specifically to house and preserve these controversial artifacts. The structure's unusual features, its double walls, specialized ventilation system, and complex internal layout, had all been engineered to maintain optimal preservation conditions while appearing to be nothing more than an agricultural storage facility. "We shield these artifacts not from humanity, but for humanity," Frederick's final entry read. "When the time comes that people can look upon these pieces and question their understanding of history rather than questioning the artifacts themselves, then our work will have been worthwhile. Until then, they must remain protected from those who fear the complications they represent to conventional wisdom." As night fell over the farm, the exploration team carefully documented their initial findings, agreeing to return in the morning with proper equipment for a more thorough investigation. Professor Winters made several encrypted calls to trusted colleagues at other universities, while Dr. Rodriguez began preliminary authentication procedures on several smaller artifacts. That night, as the Caldwell family processed the implications of their discovery, James found himself sitting alone on the farmhouse porch, staring at the partially collapsed silo illuminated by security floodlights. The structure that had been a financial burden and safety concern just that morning had transformed into something else entirely. A deliberate vault containing evidence that might challenge fundamental assumptions about human history. The revelation cast his great-grandfather in an entirely new light. Frederick hadn't been merely an eccentric farmer, but a man entrusted with preserving controversial knowledge, a guardian of historical artifacts that challenged conventional understanding. The silo hadn't been just a grain storage facility, but a purpose-built repository, its agricultural function merely a convincing disguise. For the first time in years, James felt something beyond the grinding pressure of the farm's financial struggles, a sense of purpose that transcended immediate concerns. Whatever the authentication process revealed about these artifacts, he now understood that the Caldwell Farm had been preserving more than just a family agricultural tradition. They had been unwitting custodians of a historical legacy whose significance they'd never suspected, Rebecca joined him on the porch, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders against the spring night's chill. "What are you thinking?" she asked, following his gaze to the illuminated silo. "I'm thinking about the Riverview offer," James replied, his voice reflective. "About what it means to be the steward of something you don't fully understand." Rebecca's scientific background had initially made her skeptical of the artifact's authenticity, but the meticulous preservation methods and Frederick's exhaustive documentation had convinced her that something extraordinary had been deliberately concealed beneath their farm. As a science teacher, she understood better than most how firmly established paradigms could resist contradictory evidence. "If these artifacts are what the professors think they are," she said carefully, "they don't just challenge archaeological timelines. They challenge the entire narrative of human technological development. That's not something mainstream academia will accept easily, no matter how compelling the evidence." James nodded, thinking of the stone disk with its impossibly advanced mathematical notations. Frederick wrote that humanity wasn't ready. I wonder if we're ready now. The following morning brought new complications. Word of unusual activity at the Caldwell Farm had reached local media, with a regional news van parked at the edge of the property by dawn. More concerning was the black SUV that arrived shortly after, carrying Agent Diana Mercer from the Federal Historical Preservation Office, a division neither James nor the professors had previously encountered. Agent Mercer presented credentials and spoke with practiced authority. "What you've discovered falls under our jurisdiction. Historical artifacts of potential national significance require proper protocols. We'll need to secure the site immediately." Professor Winters exchanged a significant look with Dr. Rodriguez before addressing the agent. "With respect, I'm not familiar with your division's authority in this matter. These artifacts are on private property and haven't yet been fully authenticated or catalogued. The standoff might have escalated further if not for the timely arrival of Dr. Lucas Bennett, a renowned expert in ancient technologies and symbology who Professor Winters had contacted the previous evening. His presence shifted the dynamic immediately. "Agent Mercer," Dr. Bennett nodded with clear recognition, "still monitoring discoveries that challenge the approved narrative? Some things never change." The tension between them was palpable, suggesting a history of similar encounters. After a private conversation that the others couldn't overhear, Agent Mercer reluctantly agreed to a compromise. The site would remain under the Caldwell family's control, with the academic team handling initial documentation, provided that nothing was removed from the chamber and all findings were shared with her agency. As Agent Mercer departed, Dr. Bennett explained his history. With the enigmatic federal agency, they monitor archaeological discoveries that don't fit conventional historical models. Sometimes they preserve them. Sometimes they ensure they never reach public awareness. They're part of a century-long effort to maintain historical narratives that serve specific institutional interests. "You mean they cover up historical findings?" Ethan asked, his voice reflecting youthful indignation. "It's more complicated than a simple cover-up," Dr. Bennett replied. "History isn't just about facts. It's about the frameworks we use to understand human development. Evidence that contradicts established frameworks creates cognitive dissonance. Some institutions find it easier to dismiss anomalous evidence than to reconsider foundational theories." With the immediate bureaucratic threat temporarily managed, the team returned to the chamber with proper archaeological documentation equipment. Over the next several days, they systematically catalogued the repository's contents, revealing an astonishing collection of artifacts that collectively suggested ancient civilizations had possessed knowledge and technology far beyond what conventional history acknowledged. One cabinet contained small mechanical devices of unclear purpose, crafted from materials that shouldn't have been workable with ancient technology. Another held tablets and scrolls bearing diagrams of astronomical phenomena. That included details about planetary bodies not discovered until the telescope was invented. A third contained metallurgical samples with composition analyses, showing alloys that mainstream archaeology insisted weren't developed until the modern era. Most disturbing to conventional historical understanding were the numerous artifacts, showing ancient depictions of technologies considered modern, from simple machines to what appeared to be electrical components, aviation concepts, and even what Dr. Bennett tentatively identified as primitive computing principles. A particularly extraordinary find came on the third day of their investigation. Lily, who had been carefully photographing a series of carved stone tablets, noticed a recurring pattern in what had initially appeared to be decorative elements around their borders. "Dr. Bennett," she called, excitement evident in her voice. "I think these markings might be some kind of mathematical sequence." The expert examined the tablets through a digital microscope, his expression growing increasingly astonished. "This isn't decorative at all. It's a numerical system using a base 12 mathematics, similar to what we see in ancient Babylonian calculations, but with a crucial difference." He pointed to specific sequences. "These notations are describing what we now call the Fibonacci sequence, along with calculations of pi and phi to a precision that wasn't achieved in Western mathematics until the 17th century. Even more remarkable was a small clay cylinder about the size of a soda can, covered in what initially appeared to be cuneiform writing. Dr. Rodriguez carefully photographed and scanned it before attempting a preliminary translation. "This is extraordinary," she announced after several hours of work. "If my translation is correct, this text describes what can only be interpreted as a form of binary mathematics, a concept we associate exclusively with modern computing. Yet carbon dating places this artifact at approximately 3000 BCE. The cataloging process revealed not just isolated anomalies, but a consistent pattern of advanced knowledge appearing throughout human history, only to disappear without clear explanation. Knowledge that resurfaced thousands of years later as supposedly new discoveries. By the end of the first week, their systematic documentation had produced a digital archive containing over 10,000 high-resolution photographs, 3D scans of major artifacts, and preliminary translations of texts in at least 7 ancient languages. The evidence was becoming too substantial to dismiss, yet its implications remained so contradictory to established historical narratives that mainstream acceptance seemed almost impossible. Their methodical approach was disrupted when Ethan burst into the chamber one morning, laptop in hand, his expression a mixture of excitement and concern. "You need to see this," he said, setting up his computer on a makeshift workspace. "I've been monitoring news feeds for anything related to archaeological discoveries that might connect to what we've found here." He displayed a series of recent news articles from different countries, reports of unusual discoveries that individually seemed unrelated but collectively formed a pattern. A construction site in Turkey had unearthed a sealed chamber containing artifacts with unexplained technological elements. Renovations at an old library in Prague had revealed hidden documents referencing a global network of knowledge repositories. A sinkhole in Peru had exposed what appeared to be an ancient facility with sophisticated engineering features. "These have all happened within the past 2 weeks, Ethan explained, highlighting the dates. "After we opened the chamber here, and look at this." He zoomed in on photographs from each site, revealing a familiar triangular symbol with a stylized eye, the same emblem that had appeared on Frederick's sealed letter. Dr. Bennett studied the images with growing concern. This can't be coincidence. Opening this repository may have triggered some kind of alert system within the Keeper's network. These discoveries aren't random, they're connected responses to our actions here. This theory gained credibility when unusual atmospheric phenomena began manifesting around the farm. Localized electromagnetic disturbances affected electronic equipment. Compass needles swung erratically near the silo foundation. Most concerning were the subtle vibrations emanating from certain artifacts in the chamber, as if they were responding to unseen signals. Something's connecting these sites, Professor Winters observed, monitoring the subtle energy fluctuations with specialized equipment he'd brought from the university. The artifacts aren't just passive historical objects, they're components in some kind of active network that spans continents. This revelation transformed their understanding of what they had discovered. The chamber wasn't merely a storage facility for anomalous artifacts, but a node in a global system designed by Frederick and his fellow keepers. The implications were both exciting and unsettling. What purpose could such a network serve, and why was it activating now? Their investigation took on new urgency when James received an anonymous package containing only a vintage pocket watch and a handwritten note. Time is short. Others are coming. The network is awakening. The watch, upon examination, proved to be no ordinary timepiece. Its internal mechanisms incorporated design elements similar to artifacts in the chamber, suggesting it was created by someone familiar with the Keeper's knowledge. It's a warning, Dr. Rodriguez concluded after examining the timepiece, and possibly an authentication token. Someone connected to the Keepers is trying to contact us. This warning proved prophetic when Agent Mercer returned the following day, her previously professional demeanor replaced by unmistakable urgency. The situation has escalated, she announced, producing new documentation with higher security classifications. My agency is implementing containment protocols effective immediately. This site now falls under direct federal jurisdiction. The academic team's protests were interrupted by the arrival of black SUVs carrying personnel with military bearing but no clear identification. Their equipment suggested specialized capabilities beyond standard archaeological preservation. Portable sensors, communication systems, and what appeared to be energy containment devices. This is no longer a matter of historical preservation, Agent Mercer stated, directing her team to establish a perimeter around the silo. What you've discovered has activated similar sites worldwide. The pattern suggests technological integration occurring beyond our current understanding. My agency has monitored Keeper repositories for decades, but we've never seen synchronized activation on this scale. This unexpected revelation, that a government agency had known about the Keepers all along, shifted the dynamic dramatically. Agent Mercer wasn't simply a bureaucrat enforcing regulations. She represented an organization specifically tasked with monitoring anomalous historical technologies. Your great-grandfather wasn't working in isolation, she explained to James as her team secured the property. Frederick Caldwell was part of a global network that preserved technological knowledge deemed too disruptive for mainstream implementation. Some government agencies sought to suppress this knowledge. Others, like mine, chose to monitor and protect it until humanity reached appropriate developmental stages. This explanation, while clarifying some mysteries, raised further questions about historical narratives and technological development paths. If certain technologies had been deliberately withheld from public knowledge, who had made those decisions, and what criteria determined when humanity was ready for specific innovations? The situation grew more complex when Rebecca discovered something unexpected while reviewing Frederick's personal journals. Evidence suggesting that different factions within the Keepers had disagreed about when and how their preserved knowledge should be reintroduced. There were internal conflicts, she explained, showing the relevant passages to the increasingly crowded group in their farmhouse kitchen. Frederick belonged to a faction that believed certain technologies should remain dormant until specific global conditions were met. Environmental stability, ethical governance systems, equitable resource distribution. Others advocated for earlier interventions, arguing that preserved technologies could prevent civilizational crises. This historical conflict appeared to be manifesting in the present as different repositories activated with varying patterns and intensities. The Turkish site had initiated power generation systems that created inexplicable energy readings. The Prague documents had begun revealing coordinates of additional repositories not in Frederick's records. The Peruvian facility had started producing atmospheric effects visible for miles. They're not just individual repositories, Dr. Bennett concluded, integrating data from these global phenomena. They're components of a system designed to activate in sequence, each performing specific functions within a larger process. The question is, what's the end result of this activation sequence? This question took on greater urgency when Ethan identified correlations between activation patterns and global environmental metrics. The timing isn't arbitrary, he explained, displaying charts on his laptop. Each repository is activating in precise response to specific environmental thresholds, carbon levels, oceanic temperatures, magnetic field fluctuations. It's as if the system was designed to respond to particular planetary conditions. The implications were staggering. Frederick and his contemporaries had apparently created a technological fail-safe system responsive to environmental conditions they had somehow anticipated a century earlier. The repositories weren't just preserving historical knowledge. They were designed to implement specific technological interventions when Earth's systems reached critical points. Agent Mercer's team, monitoring these correlations with their own sophisticated equipment, grew increasingly concerned. We're detecting energy signatures matching theoretical models of zero-point field manipulation, one specialist reported, studying readings from instruments arrayed around the silo foundation. If these levels continue increasing at current rates, we could see space-time distortion effects within 72 hours. This assessment prompted immediate escalation. Additional government personnel arrived, including specialists in theoretical physics and what appeared to be containment experts. Their conversations revealed perspectives that ranged from cautious optimism about potential technological breakthroughs to alarm about unpredictable consequences. The tension escalated further when Riverview Agricultural Enterprises unexpectedly filed an emergency injunction claiming the farm posed environmental hazards to surrounding properties. The timing suggested coordination with entities seeking to control access to the repository through legal channels when direct intervention proved problematic. James contacted their attorney, who confirmed the suspicious nature of the filing. This isn't standard procedure for environmental concerns, she explained during an urgent phone consultation. They've bypassed normal regulatory channels and gone directly to federal court with claims that would typically require months of environmental assessment. Someone's pulling significant strings. While legal maneuvers unfolded in courtrooms, the situation at the farm grew increasingly extraordinary. The energy patterns emanating from the repository had begun manifesting visible atmospheric effects, subtle auroras visible even during daylight hours, electromagnetic anomalies that disrupted communication systems, and localized weather patterns that defied meteorological explanation. Most concerning were the changes in certain artifacts within the chamber. Items that had appeared inert for a century now displayed unexpected properties, faint luminescence, subtle movement, and energy. Signatures that suggested activation of long-dormant functions. The stone disc at the chamber's center had begun rotating slowly on its axis without any visible mechanism, its carved symbols now emitting a faint blue-green light. Dr. Bennett, monitoring these developments with specialized equipment, identified a pattern in the energy fluctuations. "It's a signal," he announced, studying the oscillating readouts. "These energy pulses follow mathematical sequences too precise to be natural phenomena. The repository is transmitting information to other sites in the network." This observation gained support when reports arrived of synchronized phenomena at other newly discovered keeper locations worldwide. The Turkish site was generating identical energy patterns. The Prague documents had begun revealing text that changed daily, displaying information that matched observations at other repositories. The Peruvian facility had developed atmospheric effects visible from orbit, attracting attention from space agencies worldwide. The global nature of these phenomena made containment impossible. News organizations had begun broadcasting footage of the atmospheric effects. Scientific institutions issued competing analyses of the energy patterns. Social media platforms were flooded with theories ranging from scholarly assessments to apocalyptic predictions. In this atmosphere of escalating tension, Rebecca made a crucial discovery while studying Frederick's private journals. "There's a reference here to something called the convergence protocol," she explained, showing the relevant passages to the assembled experts. Frederick describes it as a predetermined sequence designed to activate when multiple repositories are discovered within a specific time frame. According to Frederick's notes, the keepers had anticipated that their repositories would eventually be discovered, either through deliberate search or accidental exposure. They had incorporated protocols governing how the preserved technologies would be reintroduced, ensuring controlled implementation rather than chaotic deployment. "The convergence isn't just about technology," Rebecca continued, translating Frederick's cryptic notations. "It's a process designed to determine whether humanity has developed the ethical frameworks necessary to responsibly implement these advances. The energy patterns we're seeing aren't just communication, they're evaluation." This revelation shifted the team's understanding of what was occurring. The repositories weren't simply activating autonomously, they were executing a predetermined assessment protocol, evaluating whether current human societies met criteria established by the keepers for responsible implementation of preserved technologies. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been decoding symbols on the rotating stone disc, found confirming evidence. "These aren't just decorative patterns," she explained, displaying enhanced photographs. "They're depicting assessment criteria, environmental stewardship metrics, conflict resolution frameworks, resource distribution ethics. The system is essentially running a planetary readiness evaluation." The implications were both profound and unsettling. Frederick and his contemporaries had created a technological system that would not only preserve advanced knowledge, but would make determinations about when and how that knowledge should be reintroduced based on humanity's demonstrated capacity for responsible implementation. This assessment process appeared to be accelerating as more repositories activated worldwide. The energy patterns grew more complex, the atmospheric effects more pronounced, and the artifact behaviors more dynamic. Whatever determination the Keeper's system was making, it was approaching completion. Agent Mercer's team, monitoring these developments with increasingly sophisticated equipment, detected a concerning pattern. The energy signatures are converging toward a critical threshold, their lead physicist reported, displaying mathematical projections. If current patterns continue, we estimate a major energetic event within 36 hours. The nature of this impending event remained unclear. Frederick's notes described the convergence in philosophical rather than technical terms, emphasizing transformation rather than specific mechanisms. The government team, taking no chances, began implementing containment protocols designed for unknown phenomena, establishing energy-dampening fields around the property and evacuating nearby farms. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," Dr. Bennett warned as specialized equipment was positioned around the silo foundation. This system was designed to resist external control. Attempting to suppress the activation process could trigger defensive protocols we're not prepared to handle. His warning proved prescient when the first containment field generated unexpected reactions from the repository. The energy-dampening technology, designed to isolate and neutralize unknown power sources, instead catalyzed accelerated responses. From the artifacts, the stone disk's rotation increased, the energy patterns intensified, and several previously inert objects began emanating visible light. "It's interpreting the containment as interference," Professor Winters concluded, monitoring the escalating energy signatures. "The system has protective measures against attempts to prevent the assessment process. We need to disengage these dampening fields immediately." Agent Mercer, receiving similar warnings from her own specialists, ordered the containment systems deactivated. The immediate crisis subsided, but the repository's activation sequence had noticeably accelerated. What had been projected to reach completion in 36 hours now showed trajectories suggesting culmination within 12 hours. As night fell over the farm, the illumination from the repository created an ethereal glow visible for miles. The assembled specialists, government, academic and private, gathered in the Caldwell farmhouse to assess options as the convergence protocol approached its apparent conclusion. "We're witnessing something unprecedented," Agent Mercer acknowledged, her official demeanor softening as the situation exceeded standard protocols. "My agency has monitored Keeper technologies for generations, but we've never observed a full convergence sequence. Previous repository discoveries were isolated incidents, contained before network activation could occur." This admission that government agencies had previously suppressed Keeper technologies created tension among the academic team, but explained the sophisticated response to their discovery. The current situation had apparently exceeded containment capabilities, forcing adaptation rather than suppression. "What exactly happens during convergence?" James asked, directing his question to those who had studied Frederick's documentation most thoroughly. "What should we expect when this assessment process completes?" Dr. Bennett, who had spent the past hours correlating Frederick's notes with energy readings from the repository, offered the clearest hypothesis. "Based on everything we've observed, the convergence appears to be a transition point when the repositories shift from passive preservation to active implementation. If the assessment criteria are met, the system begins introducing preserved technologies according to predetermined sequences." "And if the criteria aren't met?" Rebecca asked, voicing the question everyone was considering. "Frederick's notes suggest the system would return to dormancy," Dr. Rodriguez answered, consulting her translations. "The technologies would remain preserved but inactive until conditions change. The Keepers were apparently committed to responsible implementation. They wouldn't force technologies into societies unprepared to use them wisely." This perspective aligned with Frederick's character as revealed through his journals. A man deeply concerned about technological ethics, determined to preserve knowledge while ensuring it wouldn't be misused when rediscovered. The assessment system reflected this balanced approach, neither withholding beneficial technologies indefinitely nor implementing them without consideration of consequences. As midnight approached, the energy patterns emanating from the repository began forming coherent geometric structures visible in the atmosphere above the farm, interlocking tetrahedrons that pulsed with blue-green light, expanding and contracting in mathematical sequences that matched symbols on the rotating stone disk. Similar phenomena were reported at other repository sites worldwide, creating a global network of interconnected energy patterns visible from orbit. Space agencies confirmed unusual atmospheric effects spanning continents following geometric patterns that suggested deliberate design rather than natural formation. Inside the repository chamber, the artifacts had arranged themselves into new configurations without human intervention. Objects that had remained static for decades now moved with apparent purpose, forming arrangements that matched diagrams. In Frederick's journals describing implementation initialization, the stone disk at the chamber's center now rotated rapidly, generating energy fields that interfaced with other artifacts in precisely timed sequences. The combined effect created holographic projections above the disk, three-dimensional representations of technologies preserved within the repository, displayed with operational principles and implementation methods. These projections weren't static displays, but interactive demonstrations, responding to questions and examination. When Dr. Bennett inquired about a particular energy generation system, the holographic representation expanded to show detailed operational principles, material requirements, and construction methodologies. It's a technological library, he realized, watching the projections respond to further questions, not just preserving artifacts, but actively teaching implementation methods. The system is designed to transfer knowledge, not just showcase preserved objects. This educational function extended beyond the repository chamber. Similar holographic projections had appeared at other keeper sites worldwide, each demonstrating technologies appropriate to local conditions and resources. The network wasn't imposing uniform solutions, but offering tailored approaches to regional challenges. The convergence reached its apex as dawn approached, the geometric patterns above the farm intensifying until they formed a coherent energy field that connected with similar formations at other repository sites. This global network created what scientific instruments registered as a temporary stabilization of Earth's geomagnetic field, a demonstration of the network's capability to influence planetary systems. Within this stabilized field, new holographic projections appeared above the farm, global data visualizations showing environmental metrics, resource distribution patterns, conflict zones, and sustainability indicators. These displays weren't just information. They were diagnosis tools identifying critical intervention points where preserved technologies could address systemic challenges. Most significantly, these projections included implementation options rather than imposed solutions. Multiple technological approaches to each identified challenge, with projected outcomes and resource requirements clearly displayed. The system wasn't dictating specific interventions, but presenting options for human decision-making. "This is extraordinary," Professor Winters breathed, watching the holographic displays cycle through technological possibilities. The keepers weren't creating an automated intervention system. They were developing a decision support framework to help future generations address challenges they anticipated. As sunrise illuminated the farm, the energy field began stabilizing into sustained patterns rather than escalating intensity. The holographic projections consolidated into a central display above the repository chamber, what appeared to be an interface designed for human interaction with the Keeper network. This interface presented a formal query in multiple languages. Assessment phase complete. Implementation authorization requested. Does humanity accept stewardship of preserved knowledge with commitment to ethical application for collective benefit? The question hung in the morning air, visible to everyone gathered at the farm and simultaneously appearing at other repository sites worldwide. The convergence had reached its decision point, the moment when the Keeper's system would either begin implementing preserved technologies or return to dormancy based on humanity's response. This unprecedented situation created immediate jurisdictional questions. Who had authority to respond to this query on behalf of humanity? Government representatives claimed national security authority. Academic teams argued for scientific oversight. Corporate interests asserted development rights. Religious leaders called for theological assessment. In this moment of institutional confusion, James Caldwell recognized a pattern in the holographic interface, symbols matching notations in Frederick's personal journals about authorization protocols. The system wasn't designed to respond to institutional authority, but to ethical commitment from repository stewards, the families and individuals who had maintained the preservation sites across generations. This isn't about governmental or corporate authority, James explained, examining the interface patterns. The Keepers designed their system to respond to demonstrated stewardship values, not institutional power. The authorization needs to come from those who've maintained the repositories, people who've shown commitment to preservation rather than exploitation. This interpretation gained support when the interface reconfigured to display Frederick Caldwell's signature alongside similar authorizations from original Keepers worldwide, the individuals who had established the preservation network a century earlier. Below these historical signatures appeared spaces clearly intended for current stewards' authorization. The implication was clear. The Keepers had designed their system to require continuity of ethical commitment across generations. The technologies would only be implemented with authorization from those who had demonstrated stewardship values similar to the original preservationists. Agent Mercer's team, analyzing the interface with advanced sensing equipment, confirmed this assessment. The system is specifically requesting genetic and biometric confirmation from direct descendants of the original Keepers, their lead analyst reported. It's a multi-factor authentication system that can't be bypassed with institutional credentials. This design revealed another layer of the Keepers' foresight. They had anticipated that powerful institutions might attempt to seize control of their preserved technologies and had created authentication requirements that couldn't be circumvented through conventional authority structures. The system would only activate with willing participation from those who had inherited stewardship responsibilities. For James, this created a profound ethical dilemma. The authorization would determine whether technologies with potentially transformative implications for energy production, environmental remediation, and resource distribution would be implemented now or remain dormant for another generation. The responsibility felt overwhelming. Who was he to make decisions with global implications? Rebecca, sensing his hesitation, reminded him of Frederick's own words from the journals. He wrote that the repositories weren't created to impose technological determinism, but to expand human options when conventional approaches proved insufficient. The system isn't asking for uncritical acceptance, but for committed stewardship, ensuring these technologies serve humanity rather than controlling it. After consulting with Ethan and Lily, who would ultimately inherit this responsibility, James approached the interface. The holographic display responded to his presence with subtle shifts in color and intensity, apparently recognizing his genetic connection to Frederick. A scanning field analyzed his biometric patterns, confirming his identity as a Caldwell descendant. Similar scenes were unfolding at other repository sites worldwide, where steward families faced the same momentous decision. Through the network's communications, James could see other descendants approaching interfaces in Turkey, Peru, Prague, and locations he hadn't previously known about: Japan, Australia, South Africa, and more. The Keeper's network was truly global, transcending national and cultural boundaries. When James placed his hand on the authorization panel, the interface displayed a more detailed ethical framework, principles governing how the preserved technologies should be implemented. These weren't merely technical guidelines, but comprehensive, ethical commitments. Technologies must serve collective well-being, not narrow interests. Implementation should enhance environmental health, not deplete it. Knowledge must be shared equitably, not monopolized. Applications should empower communities, not control them. Development must respect cultural diversity and self-determination. Benefits should extend to future generations, not just present ones. This framework reflected Frederick's deeply held values, as revealed in his journals. A vision of technological development guided by environmental stewardship, social responsibility, and intergenerational justice. The authorization wasn't simply agreeing to release technologies, but committing to implement them according to these principles. After careful consideration, James provided his authorization, joined by stewards at other sites worldwide. The collective decision wasn't made lightly, but with recognition that humanity faced challenges requiring expanded technological options, and with commitment to ensure those options would be implemented responsibly. The system responded to this authorization by initiating what Frederick's journals had called graduated implementation, a phased introduction of preserved technologies, beginning with those addressing critical environmental stabilization needs, while deferring more transformative applications pending development of appropriate oversight mechanisms. The immediate effects were subtle but measurable. The energy fields surrounding the repository stabilized into sustained patterns rather than fluctuating intensity. The holographic interface transformed into a comprehensive knowledge transfer system, organizing the preserved technologies into implementation categories with detailed technical specifications, resource requirements, and ethical guidelines. Most significantly, the system began transmitting this information not just to government or corporate entities, but to diverse knowledge networks worldwide: universities, community organizations, indigenous knowledge keepers, and independent researchers. The distribution pattern clearly reflected the keeper's commitment to preventing knowledge monopolization by any single authority structure. They designed the system to resist centralized control, Dr. Bennett observed, watching the information distribution patterns. The knowledge is being shared through so many channels simultaneously that no entity can effectively suppress or monopolize it. It's an inherently democratizing approach to technological implementation. This design feature created immediate tension with institutional structures accustomed to controlling technological development. Government agencies attempted to classify certain technologies as national security concerns. Corporate entities filed preemptive patent applications. Regulatory bodies sought to impose existing frameworks on innovations that operated on entirely different principles. These control attempts proved largely ineffective as the information spread through too many channels to contain. Within days, research teams worldwide were replicating basic applications of keeper technologies, particularly those addressing urgent environmental needs like water purification, soil remediation, and localized clean energy production. The repository at the Caldwell Farm became a demonstration site for agricultural applications specifically technologies that could regenerate depleted soils, enhance water retention, and increase crop resilience without chemical dependencies. These approaches operated on principles that conventional agricultural science had largely overlooked: microbial symbiosis, electromagnetic soil conditioning, and plant communication networks. Frederick specifically focused this repository on agricultural sustainability, Rebecca realized, studying the implementation frameworks. Each keeper site appears specialized for regional needs and conditions. They weren't creating a one-size-fits-all technological solution, but a diverse ecosystem of approaches tailored to local contexts. This specialization extended across the global network. The Turkish repository concentrated on water management technologies especially suited to arid regions. The Peruvian site focused on technologies adapted to high-altitude environments. The Japanese location specialized in disaster resilience systems. Each repository offered knowledge particularly relevant to its geographical and cultural context. For the Caldwell family, the weeks following authorization brought transformative changes. Their struggling farm rapidly became a vibrant research center where agricultural specialists, environmental scientists, and community practitioners gathered to study and implement soil regeneration technologies preserved in the repository. The fields that had been losing productivity for decades showed remarkable recovery under these approaches. Soil structure improved dramatically, beneficial microbial communities flourished, water retention increased substantially, crop yields rose while input requirements decreased. The land was responding to methodologies that worked with natural systems rather than attempting to override them. These aren't really new technologies, James observed, watching researchers implementing soil remediation protocols derived from repository knowledge. They're forgotten understandings, approaches that were developed in various cultures but marginalized during industrial agricultural development because they couldn't be patented or centrally controlled. This pattern appeared consistent across many keeper technologies. They weren't primarily novel inventions, but preserved knowledge that had been developed in diverse cultures, yet excluded from mainstream technological evolution due to economic structures favoring centralized, resource-intensive approaches with clear profit potential. The preserved knowledge wasn't rejecting scientific advancement, but suggesting alternative development paths that mainstream institutions had not prioritized, approaches emphasizing sustainability, local adaptation, and distributed implementation rather than standardization and centralized control. This fundamental difference created both opportunities and challenges for integration with existing systems. The technologies worked demonstrably well, producing verifiable results that convinced even skeptical observers. Yet they operated on principles that often contradicted established scientific paradigms, creating resistance from institutions invested in conventional approaches. It's not about whether these technologies work, Professor Winters explained during a briefing for visiting scientists. The empirical evidence is clear. It's about whether our institutional frameworks can adapt to approaches that operate on different organizational principles, distributed rather than centralized, collaborative rather than competitive, cyclical rather than linear. This adaptation process unfolded differently across various sectors. Agricultural applications gained relatively rapid acceptance as farmers observed clear results in neighboring fields. Energy technologies faced stronger resistance from entrenched industrial interests despite demonstrable efficiency improvements. Medical applications encountered regulatory frameworks ill-suited to approaches operating on unfamiliar principles. Through these varied responses, the graduated implementation continued steadily, introducing technologies at scales that allowed for observation and adaptation rather than disruptive transformation. The keepers had apparently designed their system to facilitate integration rather than revolution, allowing existing institutions to evolve rather than collapse. 1 year after the repository's initial discovery, the Caldwell Farm had transformed. Beyond recognition, the fields that had been struggling to maintain productivity under conventional agriculture now showcased regenerative approaches that agricultural specialists traveled from across the globe to study. The partially reconstructed silo, its damaged section, preserved as historical testament to the discovery process, had become the central feature of a research campus where scientists from diverse disciplines collaborated to integrate preserved knowledge with contemporary understanding. The autumn harvest that year produced yields that defied conventional agricultural projections, not through chemical intensification or genetic modification, but through approaches that enhanced soil, biological activity, mycorrhizal network development, and plant microbe symbiosis. Fields that had been depleted by decades of industrial practices showed remarkable recovery, demonstrating resilience that neighboring farms observed with increasing interest. The true innovation here isn't technological but conceptual, Dr. Rodriguez explained to a delegation of agricultural ministers visiting from various countries. These approaches don't view soil as an inert growing medium to be augmented with external inputs, but as a complex living system to be cultivated in its own right. The yield increases come from working with natural processes rather than attempting to override them. This perspective characterized many keeper technologies. They weren't rejecting scientific understanding, but suggesting different conceptual frameworks for applying that understanding. The preserved knowledge demonstrated approaches that emphasized systemic relationships rather than isolated components, cyclic processes rather than linear extraction, and distributed implementation rather than centralized control. For the Caldwell family, this transformation extended beyond their physical property to their understanding of their inheritance and responsibility. The land that had seemed a financial burden threatening to end 4 generations of family stewardship had revealed its deeper purpose. Not merely agricultural production, but preservation of knowledge that might help humanity navigate challenges. Frederick had somehow anticipated nearly a century earlier. I think I understand why he was so insistent about keeping the farm in the family, James told Rebecca, as they watched researchers implementing soil carbon sequestration techniques in fields that had once seemed destined for corporate acquisition. He wasn't just preserving land or agricultural traditions. He was maintaining positioned access to knowledge that would become essential when conventional approaches reached their limitations. This realization had transformed their relationship to their inheritance. The financial struggles that had nearly forced them to sell to Riverview Agricultural Enterprises now seemed like the final test of their commitment to a stewardship. Responsibility whose full significance they hadn't understood. The preservation of the land hadn't been an end in itself, but the necessary condition for fulfilling the farm's true purpose when the appropriate moment arrived. For Ethan and Lily, this transformation had opened unexpected future paths that aligned their individual talents with meaningful participation in addressing global challenges. Ethan's technological interests had found perfect application in adapting preserved knowledge to contemporary implementation contexts. His expertise in digital systems had proven essential for translating ancient knowledge frameworks into formats accessible to modern understanding. Lily's artistic sensitivity to patterns and symbols had become similarly valuable as researchers worked to interpret knowledge systems that often relied on visual representations rather than linear text. Her ability to recognize relationships between seemingly distinct symbolic elements had helped decode implementation protocols that more technically oriented researchers had struggled to interpret. Frederick didn't just preserve knowledge, Lilly observed. Studying intricate diagrams from a recently translated implementation manual, he preserved different ways of knowing, approaches to understanding complex systems that our educational frameworks have marginalized in favor of reductionist methodologies. The symbols aren't just conveying information, they're teaching different ways of perceiving relationships. This insight reflected a broader pattern emerging across the Keeper network. The preserved knowledge wasn't merely offering alternative technologies, but suggesting different epistemological approaches, ways of organizing understanding that mainstream institutional frameworks had systematically excluded during industrial development. These alternatives weren't rejecting scientific methodology, but complementing it with perspectives that recognized limitations in strictly reductionist approaches. The knowledge systems preserved in various repositories integrated analytical precision with holistic understanding, quantitative measurement with qualitative discernment, empirical observation with systems-level awareness. The integration of these perspectives with contemporary scientific frameworks created both challenges and opportunities. Institutional structures optimized for specialized expertise struggled to accommodate approaches that transcended disciplinary boundaries. Regulatory systems designed for familiar technological paradigms proved inadequate for innovations operating on different principles. Economic models predicated on resource extraction and centralized control faced fundamental contradictions with technologies designed for regenerative cycles and distributed implementation. Despite these institutional challenges, the empirical effectiveness of the implemented technologies continued driving adoption, particularly as environmental conditions deteriorated globally. Extreme weather events, soil productivity declines, and water quality degradation created urgent demand for approaches that could address challenges conventional technologies were struggling to resolve. The timing wasn't coincidental, Dr. Bennett concluded after analyzing atmospheric data correlations with repository activation patterns. The Keepers designed their system to activate when specific environmental thresholds were crossed, precisely when the limitations of conventional approaches would become most apparent and alternatives most necessary. This analysis suggested a degree of foresight that seemed almost prescient. How could Frederick and his contemporaries have anticipated specific environmental thresholds nearly a century before they occurred? The explanation lay not in supernatural prediction, but in sophisticated understanding of system dynamics and developmental trajectories. They weren't guessing about future conditions, Professor Winters explained, reviewing newly translated sections of Frederick's technical journals. They were extrapolating system dynamics based on resource consumption patterns, energy utilization trajectories, and biogeochemical cycle disruptions that were already measurable during their era. Their projections weren't prophecy, but mathematical modeling, remarkably sophisticated for their time, but fundamentally based on observable trends. Dadu. This perspective helped contextualize the Keepers' motivation and methods. They hadn't been opposing technological development, but anticipating limitations in specific developmental pathways, particularly those prioritizing short-term resource extraction over long-term system stability. Their preserved knowledge offered alternatives not to reject advancement, but to suggest different trajectories when established approaches reached predictable constraints. 18 months after the repository's discovery, these alternatives were demonstrating their value across diverse implementation contexts. The agricultural approaches showcased at the Caldwell Farm had been adapted for various regional conditions, showing particular effectiveness in areas facing soil degradation challenges that conventional methods couldn't effectively address. Energy technologies derived from repository knowledge had progressed from demonstration projects to community-scale implementations, particularly in regions where conventional infrastructure was prohibitively expensive or environmentally problematic. These systems operated on principles that mainstream physics was still working to fully explain, but which produced measurable results that pragmatic communities readily embraced. Water purification and management approaches preserved in various repositories had proven especially valuable in regions facing intensifying drought conditions or contamination challenges. These technologies operated on principles that combined physical filtration with biological processing and energetic restructuring, integrated approaches that conventional water management had often fragmented into separate specialized domains. Most significantly, these implementations weren't creating new dependencies, but enhancing community resilience through technologies specifically designed for local adaptation and distributed control. Unlike conventional approaches that typically required specialized expertise, proprietary components, and centralized maintenance systems, Keeper technologies emphasize principles that could be locally understood, implemented, and maintained. They designed these systems for genuine sustainability, Rebecca observed, watching community practitioners adapt soil regeneration techniques to local conditions without requiring ongoing external inputs or expertise. Not just environmental sustainability, but economic and social sustainability as well. Approaches that communities can truly own and evolve rather than remaining perpetually dependent on external providers. This fundamental difference created both promise and tension as implementation expanded globally. Communities embracing these technologies often found themselves at odds with institutional structures designed around dependency relationships and centralized control. Regulatory frameworks optimized for familiar technological paradigms struggled to categorize innovations operating on different principles. Economic models predicated on scarcity and extraction faced contradictions with approaches designed for regeneration and abundance. Yet the empirical effectiveness of these alternatives continued driving adoption despite institutional resistance, particularly as environmental conditions created urgent need for approaches that could address challenges conventional technologies were struggling to resolve. The knowledge preserved by Frederick and his contemporaries was demonstrating its value precisely as they had anticipated. When established approaches reached limitations they had foreseen nearly a century earlier. For the Caldwell family, watching this global implementation unfold from their transformed farm, the experience prompted deeper reflection on meaning and purpose across generations. Frederick hadn't been preserving knowledge for his own benefit, or even primarily for his immediate descendants. He had been maintaining options for generations not yet born, anticipating challenges they would face and preserving alternatives they might need. This perspective transformed their understanding of inheritance and responsibility. The land they had struggled to maintain hadn't merely been a farm, but a carefully positioned repository of knowledge, preserved against humanity's moment of environmental reckoning. The financial challenges that had nearly forced them to sell their heritage had been the final obstacle before fulfilling its deeper purpose. 2 years after the initial discovery, as winter snow blanketed the research campus that had emerged, around the partially reconstructed silo, James stood with Rebecca watching implementation specialists demonstrate cold weather growing techniques derived from repository knowledge, approaches that extended production seasons without energy-intensive greenhouse systems by working with natural microclimate dynamics. I wonder if Frederick could see the whole picture, Rebecca mused, observing the diverse research teams collaborating across disciplines that conventional academia typically separated. Whether he understood exactly how the knowledge he preserved would eventually be implemented, or if he was simply maintaining options against future needs he could only partially anticipate. I think that's exactly what makes his work so remarkable, James replied. He wasn't imposing a predetermined technological future, but preserving possibilities that might become essential when circumstances evolved in ways he couldn't specifically predict. It wasn't about control, but about ensuring options would remain available when they became necessary. This perspective reflected what they had learned about the Keeper's fundamental philosophy. Not technological determinism, but technological diversity, maintaining alternatives that institutional momentum might otherwise eliminate. They had recognized that resilience required options, especially when dominant approaches reached limitations their proponents couldn't acknowledge until alternatives demonstrated otherwise. The snow continued falling around the research complex that had emerged from what had been a struggling family farm, physical manifestation of transformation from apparent failure to profound purpose. The legacy Frederick had entrusted to future generations wasn't merely land or agricultural traditions, but knowledge preserved against humanity's moment of greatest need. Responsibility that extended far beyond their Pennsylvania property to address challenges facing civilization itself. As implementations expanded globally, the network Frederick and his fellow keepers had created continued its carefully graduated approach, introducing technologies at scales that allowed for observation and adaptation rather than disruptive transformation. The system wasn't imposing revolutionary change, but offering evolutionary options, allowing existing institutions to adapt rather than collapse. This approach reflected sophisticated understanding of how complex systems change, not through sudden replacement, but through emergence of alternatives that demonstrate effectiveness within niches before expanding as conditions favor their attributes. The keepers hadn't been attempting to overthrow existing technological regimes, but to ensure alternatives would be available when dominant approaches encountered limitations they couldn't overcome through intensification of established methods. 3 years after the repository's discovery, this pattern was becoming increasingly apparent across diverse implementation contexts. Regions facing severe soil degradation that conventional approaches couldn't effectively address were adopting agricultural methods derived from repository knowledge, demonstrating productivity improvements that neighboring areas observed with growing interest. Communities struggling with water quality challenges were implementing purification systems that operated on principles conventional treatment couldn't replicate at comparable resource requirements. Most significantly, these implementations weren't creating dependency relationships but enhancing community resilience through technologies specifically designed for local adaptation and distributed control. Unlike conventional approaches that typically consolidated expertise, ownership, and decision-making in centralized institutions, keeper technologies emphasized principles that communities could understand, implement, and evolve through their own agency. This fundamental difference creates both the greatest promise and the greatest resistance, Dr. Bennett observed during a global implementation assessment conference hosted at the Caldwell Farm. These technologies aren't just offering different methods, but suggesting different relationships between communities and resources, between humans and natural systems, between generations present and future. The technical innovations challenge institutional frameworks precisely because they embody different values. This observation highlighted tensions emerging as implementation expanded beyond early adopters to engage mainstream institutions. The knowledge preserved in the repositories wasn't merely offering technical alternatives, but suggesting different organizing principles for human systems, distributed rather than centralized, collaborative rather than competitive, regenerative rather than extractive. These differences created fundamental challenges for institutional structures optimized around opposing values. Yet the empirical effectiveness of these alternatives continued driving adoption despite institutional resistance, particularly as environmental conditions deteriorated globally. The fields that had been losing productivity for decades now showcased regenerative approaches that attracted agricultural specialists from around the world. The silo that had been a maintenance burden had become a technological heritage site, drawing researchers from diverse disciplines. I think Frederick would recognize this as fulfilling exactly what he hoped for, James told Rebecca one evening as they watched the sunset from their porch, overlooking fields where research teams were implementing soil mycorrhizal network enhancements derived from repository knowledge. Not because his specific vision is being implemented, but because humanity has additional options when they're most needed. This outcome reflected the keeper's apparent intentions, not to dictate technological development, but to expand possibilities when conventional approaches proved insufficient. Extreme weather events, soil productivity declines, water availability challenges, and energy system vulnerabilities created expanding niches where conventional approaches couldn't effectively respond, creating opportunities for alternatives to demonstrate their comparative advantages. 4 years after the initial discovery, the Caldwell Farm had evolved into a globally recognized implementation center where agricultural specialists, environmental scientists, community practitioners, and policy analysts gathered to study not just specific technologies, but integration approaches for combining preserved knowledge with contemporary understanding. The fields that had been losing productivity for decades now showcased regenerative systems that demonstrated resilience against increasingly volatile climate conditions. The true innovation isn't any specific technique, but the integrated perspective, James explained to a delegation of agricultural ministers visiting from countries facing severe soil degradation challenges. These approaches don't address isolated problems through specialized interventions, but enhance system relationships that generate multiple benefits simultaneously: soil health, water retention, carbon sequestration, biodiversity support. The productivity improvements emerge from system function rather than input intensification. This perspective characterized many keeper technologies. They weren't offering isolated solutions to specific problems, but integrated approaches that recognized relationships between challenges that conventional frameworks often fragmented into separate specialized domains. The preserved knowledge demonstrated methods that worked with rather than against natural system dynamics, enhancing processes that industrial approaches had often disrupted through misunderstanding their fundamental importance. For Ethan and Lily, now pursuing advanced studies that integrated their individual talents with implementation needs, this systems perspective had transformed their educational experience. Rather than specializing in increasingly narrow domains, they were developing transdisciplinary understanding that could bridge conceptual frameworks that conventional education typically separated. The most valuable thing I've learned isn't any specific technique, but different ways of perceiving relationships, Lily explained during a presentation at her university, where she was helping develop curriculum incorporating preservation knowledge. The symbols and diagrams in the repository aren't just conveying information, they're teaching different ways of recognizing patterns and connections that our conventional educational frameworks often exclude. This insight reflected broader implications emerging as preserved knowledge integrated with contemporary understanding. The repositories weren't merely offering alternative technologies, but suggesting different epistemological approaches, ways of organizing knowledge that mainstream institutional frameworks had systematically marginalized during industrial development, often not through deliberate suppression, but through optimization around different priorities. 5 years after the repository's discovery, these alternative frameworks were demonstrating increasing value as implementation expanded globally. Regions implementing integrated approaches derived from preservation knowledge were showing remarkable resilience against climate volatility that was creating growing challenges for conventional systems. Communities adopting distributed energy technologies were maintaining functionality through extreme weather events that disrupted centralized infrastructure. Agricultural areas implementing soil regeneration practices were maintaining productivity through drought conditions that devastated neighboring regions dependent on input-intensive approaches. These empirical results were shifting the conversation from theoretical debate to practical assessment. Even institutions initially resistant to preserved knowledge were beginning to incorporate elements that demonstrated clear advantages, particularly as environmental conditions continued deteriorating globally, creating urgency for effective interventions beyond what conventional approaches could provide. The Caldwell Farm had evolved into something Frederick might have envisioned, a demonstration center where preserved knowledge was being adapted to address contemporary challenges while developing implementation frameworks that ensured benefits, served collective well-being rather than narrow interests. The preserved knowledge wasn't replacing mainstream science, but complementing it, suggesting alternative approaches when established methods couldn't effectively address emerging challenges. As twilight deepened over the farm, lights illuminated the research complex that had emerged around the partially reconstructed silo. The structure that had collapsed during a spring storm, revealing secrets preserved for a century, now stood as monument to multi-generational purpose, reminder that true legacy transcends immediate circumstances to serve needs that may only become apparent generations later. Inside the repository chamber, now carefully preserved and incorporated into a modern research facility, the stone disc continued its slow rotation, physical manifestation of knowledge preserved across generations. The artifacts around it remained in their activation configuration, continuing to share preserved knowledge through systems the keepers had designed to resist monopolization by any single authority. The holographic interface above the chamber displayed real-time implementation data from around the world, agricultural sites applying soil regeneration techniques, communities implementing water purification systems, localized energy networks. Operating on principles mainstream physics was still working to fully explain. The knowledge wasn't being imposed, but adopted, where it demonstrated effectiveness in addressing genuine needs. For the Caldwell family, watching this global implementation unfold from their transformed Pennsylvania farm, the experience had fundamentally shifted their understanding of inheritance and responsibility. The land they had struggled to maintain hadn't merely been a farm, but a carefully positioned repository of knowledge preserved against humanity's moment of environmental reckoning. The financial challenges that had nearly forced them to sell their heritage to corporate interests had been the final obstacle before fulfilling Frederick's vision, preserving knowledge until it became essential for addressing challenges he had somehow anticipated would emerge generations after his lifetime. As night fell over the farm, stars becoming visible above fields, now demonstrating resilience principles derived from preserved knowledge, James reflected on how completely their understanding of their family legacy had transformed. Frederick hadn't merely been an eccentric farmer with unusual construction practices. He had been a visionary who recognized that technological evolution wasn't linear progress, but complex adaptation, with potentially viable pathways often eliminated through institutional momentum rather than technical inferiority. By preserving knowledge that had been marginalized during industrial development, whether ancient wisdom traditions or alternative scientific approaches that lacked institutional support, Frederick and his fellow keepers had created a reservoir of options available when conventional technologies faced limitations too severe to ignore. The repositories weren't replacing established approaches, but complementing them, offering alternatives when dominant methods proved insufficient for emerging challenges. The century-old silo that had collapsed during a spring storm had revealed not just forbidden artifacts, but a different understanding of technological development, not as singular progress, but as complex evolution with multiple viable pathways. Many systematically excluded not through technical assessment, but through economic and institutional dynamics that narrowed possibilities based on criteria unrelated to long-term effectiveness or sustainability. This perspective transformed apparent failure into profound purpose. The farm that had seemed economically unsustainable under conventional agriculture had fulfilled its deeper intention, preserving knowledge until it became essential for addressing challenges its stewards couldn't fully anticipate, but whose eventual emergence they recognized through careful observation of system trajectories. As the stars wheeled overhead, James contemplated how Frederick's actions reflected wisdom largely missing from societies optimized for quarterly profits and electoral cycles, the capacity for multi-generational purpose, for planting seeds knowing you won't live to see them mature, for preserving knowledge against needs that may only become apparent decades or centuries after your lifetime. This perspective, that true legacy transcends immediate circumstances to serve generations not yet born, had transformed the Caldwell family's relationship with their inheritance. What had seemed burden had become purpose. What had seemed failure had become fulfillment. What had seemed ending had become new beginning. The collapsed silo had revealed not just ancient artifacts, but timeless wisdom. That genuine stewardship extends beyond what we can personally witness to embrace needs we can only imperfectly anticipate, but must nevertheless prepare to address. As dawn approached, bringing first light to fields, now demonstrating resilience principles derived from knowledge preserved for a century, James watched researchers arriving for another day, implementing approaches that Frederick could only have imagined would eventually prove necessary. The century-old silo stood partially reconstructed against the brightening sky, its damaged section preserved as reminder of how catastrophic failure can sometimes reveal profound purpose when its time arrives. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.